See these? They stop you shitting yourself. Unfortunately, no equivalent of these in CS for most of NiKo's teammates during a lot of his time in mousesports, especially the classic era. Now, I'll tell you what, I'd have loved it if I'd have been playing fantasy esports at EsportsPools when NiKosports had been around, because I'd have gone ahead and picked NiKo in any tournament that had enough tier 2 teams that he could really rampage over the entire field, still rack up a lot of frags, even if he doesn't end up winning the tournament because his team had no real chance to win big tournaments. And also, I wouldn't have to pick any of his teammates. What's more, I'd have loved the new in-play betting feature, which only EsportsPools can bring to you in terms of esports betting services, where you can make bets during the game. Because if the map ever went to Dust 2 or Cash and the opponent was anything less than godlike on those maps, I'd have definitely been going all in on mousesports to get the upset wins that they were occasionally able to on those specialist maps, whereas we all know when they got over to stuff like Train and Cobble, they were straight trash cans. Now, speaking of straight trash cans, surrounded by something revolutionary that doesn't exist elsewhere in the world, no longer talking about EsportsPools and making bets on mouse, I'm now talking about the notion, a fairly popular one, it's been repeated many times over the years, and it's still even often repeated to this day, but in a different context, that mousesports somehow got better without NiKo and due to NiKo leaving. And usually people then follow that up by saying NiKo wasn't a good fit. In the past, before he'd had all the success with FaZe, sometimes while he was still in the team, they'd say it's because NiKo was too selfish when he was in mousesports. He warped the entire team around himself so that he could be amazing and be the superstar player. Some people even suggested that him being that good somehow took all the kills from the others, and that's why the others struggled to look good or to frag to the same or even a reasonable degree. People imply that his style of play was so rigid that it held others in the team back from being able to play a style more conducive to good play from them or developing as players. They even suggest that Nex, the other star player in the team, was held back from performing by NiKo, held back from getting to a star level, which we'd seen from time to time before NiKo had joined the team, when it had been Nex was the main star and GodB was the in-game leader in control of the team. Now, the proof, they would suggest, is that when NiKo left, Mouse got better, or played better, or looked like a better team in some sense. Now let's break all this down point by point. Firstly, one of the biggest problems with this argument and the way it's framed is that it's incredibly disingenuous or just outright dishonest to frame it that way. Like, there was NiKo and mousesports and they weren't that good, and then there was mousesports after NiKo and they're much better now. Therefore, you know, what's the one factor here? Because that's exactly the point I'm going to make initially here, which is there weren't just two mousesports lineups, the one before him and the one with him and the one after. There were actually 5 different 5-man lineups during NiKo's time with mousesports. There was a lineup just before he entered the starting lineup, which actually is important to explain because it sets up the context of the 5 lineups which followed it, which was during the time mostly where he was a very good player and was the star of the team. Then, since NiKo, there have been 2 different 5-man lineups and something like 3 roster moves just since he's left the team. And so we must contrast each of those lineups to his prime classic NiKo mousesports lineup to see, actually, did they do better? Are they better teams? So first and foremost, as I said, with NiKo in mousesports, there were 5 different lineups. So the first lineup, you may remember, NiKo joins the starting lineup on August 30th, replacing Spiddy, and this was the lineup which still had GodB in it as the in-game leader. But remember, before we can get to that, we have to ask ourselves, well, why are they replacing Spiddy in the first place? Why are they putting NiKo into this lineup as it is? Since the context is that also, while he was in mousesports, people were like, oh, the GodB lineup was better and they should have stuck with GodB. So why do they make this move to change out Spiddy and later on to cut GodB? Well, here's the thing. NiKo, before he even joined mousesports, was clearly a talent. Now, we didn't know he was as good as he then went on to be because he hadn't done it yet. But he'd already shown these real flashes of brilliance, and at the time was a pretty young guy. I think he was about 17 years old at the time. In June of 2015, so this is a couple of months before he joined the starting lineup, he'd been a stand-in for Kingwin, the squad, not to be confused with the Polish squad, the squad that was basically became G2, the Scream, Makalele, Dennis later. He stood in for this squad. In fact, Dennis at this point in time, I think, he stood in for that team at a LAN, which was the Gaming Paradise Closed qualifier, and he went ham. He was fantastic at this one. His fragging was out of this world. They played Flipside in 2 best-of-3s. He rocked them. Then after that, about a month and a half later, he stood in for the Danish SK Gaming team at IEM Gamescom, that tournament where it was like he made alliances and the audience picked who played, what the map was, and then the teams somehow picked who played each other. I think the winner picked the team who played next. When he played for these ones, again, he fragged pretty well. His stats weren't as crazy, but he was playing in an all-Danish lineup, to be fair. And also that team just wasn't a very good team, that SK Danish lineup, especially not at that point in time when they didn't have some of the other players they later got. Now, mousesports had been a good team before NiKo got there. They'd been rising up the ranks. They'd had a couple of good placings and some really promising matches, such as that Gfinity Spring Masters 2, where they made top 4. But here's the problem. Just before NiKo was put into the starting lineup, they went to ESL 1 Cologne. So they went to the major, the first major mousesports actually were qualified for with this era lineup. And they were considered a team who should get Legends spot, who might have a shot at maybe making a top 4 run, maybe upsetting a big team. Not only that, it's on home soil. People like Gobby, Spiddy, well, Spiddy's still in the line, Dennis, Nex, all live in Germany. They have no jet lag whatsoever, no issues whatsoever. It should be, in theory, the most comfortable, big tier 1 tournament for them to play. And they shit the bed and came last place. They lost to Cloud9, the summer Cloud9, who was a pretty good team, but on Overpass, not really a Cloud9 map when you think of it. They lost to Flipside, and at this point in time, this is not ESL Cologne 2016 where Flipside came top 8. Flipside was not a good team at this point in time. Again, it used to be a miracle they would qualify for these majors. They lost to Flipside on Cobblestone. Not even the best Flipside map, and actually a map that mousesports had looked pretty decent on. So they shit the bed completely and went out in last place. So as such, they're not going to cut God B, who was a very low fragger. Nexus had his issues at this major, but he's the star player. So they cut Spiddy, a player who had massively underperformed, particularly from memory, I think, in the Flipside game. So they cut him out of the lineup, and they brought in NiKo instead of Spiddy. So they upgrade one of the weakest players for a strong player, and they keep their in-game leader, and they keep their star player Nex. Now, with this team, people forget that they played a few LANs before God B was cut. They played at Gaming Paradise itself, the actual main event from the one that he'd helped Kingwin qualify for. So playing with mousesports here, his team finished 5th to 6th. Okay, admittedly, not very good placing. But actually, the teams they lost a best of 3 to the Shocks era Titan. Shocks had just rejoined. They had RPK. They had Scream at this point in time, I think. Let me think. Would they have had him at this point? I forget, actually. I think maybe they didn't. But that team, actually, Titan, ended up having a good run at this term, ended up finishing 3rd, and then they lost in the lower bracket in a best of 1 to Navi, who actually ended up finishing 2nd overall, and obviously at the major, which was the next big event, basically, came 2nd there as well, so we're a pretty good team. So actually not bad results overall. They went to the next major, DreamHack Cluj-Napoca, and this time they finished better than before. They didn't come last place. They finished 9th to 12th, which means that they finished 3rd in their group. Now, in their group, which, by the way, had TSM, but they never had to play TSM, they played G2 first of all. And G2 was the new name for Kingwin, and G2 had just added Jacob. So they played G2 on Inferno, and they lost to them. Fair enough. That's a fine result. They beat Flipside. They then had to play G2 in a best of 3 to decide who got out of the group. And NiKo carried the fuck out of the first 2 maps. mousesports very nearly won 2-0, but on the first map, Mirage, Makaleli went ham and won tons of clutches and 1v2s and 1v1s, went totally ham. And for the whole series, this was Jacob's first super ham series at a big tournament offline. He went absolutely nuts. So those factors stopped them from 2-0 and actually getting out of the group and getting a Legends spot. Otherwise, they would have had a Legends spot. Then they had their last tournament before they kicked God B was just a week or so after the major, and it was the CEVO Professional Season 8 offline finals. And this is where In the group, they beat Na'Vi, the team that had just finished runner-up at the major. They 2-0'd them. NiKo was plus 20 for the series. They 2-0'd Luminosity, Fallen's team. Not the one that has cold zero at this point in time, but not the one that had FNX and Taco. That was a couple of months ago. That was actually, well, it was actually a couple of weeks away. But they 2-0'd those. NiKo went plus 22 against another Legend Spot team. In the semis, they played Shazam's Conquest team, basically some of the roots of Optic. And NiKo and Nex were pretty good here. In the final, the entire team was underwhelming. NiKo had his issues, but they were playing Virtus Pro. Virtus Pro was extremely good at the time, and Virtus Pro 3-0'd them, but were a truly world-class team. So they got second place at a pretty decent LAN with some good teams in attendance. Then, God B got kicked. Nothing to do with NiKo, is due to lack of dedication. That's what I was told by a number of people within the team. He wasn't putting in the hours. He didn't seem as dedicated. And they were offering him initially a coaching spot, but then he wanted to play. So, God B was kicked out of the team. Now, let's consider the period now that NiKo was in the team with God B. So, NiKo was very good in this mousesports with God B in the team as well. And Nex was there, and Nex was doing fine as well, but had his own matches that weren't that great. So, here's what's weird about that. I thought before people implied the only reason NiKo was getting those numbers later on after God B is because God B wasn't there and he just called all around himself. But he's having sick numbers with God B. Not only that, he's playing with God B and he hasn't had to walk the whole team towards himself. They still had a couple of good results, and that's with God B and Nex there. Also, Nex seems to do fine with NiKo playing, even though people claim it's NiKo who held Nex back. It's all going fine. So the playing style didn't have to warp around NiKo for him to get MVP level numbers. Then we go to the second lineup that has NiKo in it, which is the one where Spiddy comes back into the lineup and replaces God B. This took place on December 16th of 2015. So here are the results they had after that. They went to DreamHack Leipzig, again in Germany. They didn't do very well. They didn't get out of the group stage. They went to the Acer Predator Masters, also in Germany. This is a Tier 2, Tier 3 LAN. They win the LAN easily. Nex dominates because it's against Tier 2. NiKo's godlike, obviously, but it's Tier 2. They go to the IEM World Championship. They don't get out of the group, even though NiKo plays insanely. He had that amazing game against Fnatic on Dust 2, where he went toe-to-toe with Olaf Meister, who's probably the best player in the world, and I would argue actually outperformed him. But they were in the group of death. They couldn't get out of that one. They went to MLG Columbus, the major. They finished 9th to 12th, just as good as they ever had done with God B in the lineup, by the way. But didn't get out of the group, famously. That was the one where Nip actually had Threat as a stand-in. They went to DreamHack Malmo, which is the tournament everyone forgets. And actually, what people forget is they got out of a very tough group. They got out of the group that had Luminosity, champions of the last major, Team Liquid, top 4 at the last major, and Tai Lu, the shocking underdog team. It was actually Tai Lu and mouz who got out of the group. And what happened here was, when they got to the round of 8, they played Godsent, and it was a very close series in certain areas. And actually, Godsent were obviously on a heat of that tournament and beat them 2-1 and went forwards in the tournament. Now, in this tournament, both NiKo and Nex played well. Nex managed to play well. That's weird, because everyone told me Nex never played well in mouz because of NiKo at the Tier 1 tournaments. But he did absolutely fine here against some top-level competition. They then had ESL1 Cologne, another major, 2016. They finished 9th to 12th. Again, still the best finish for a mousesports team ever. They were in a tough group, admittedly, because they had the Team Liquid who ended up going to the final in that group, and they had Virtus Pro in that group, who obviously ended up finishing top 4 and actually had a chance to win that major when you look how they played in the semi against SK. The final tournament for this lineup was E-League Season 1, and this is where, first of all, NiKo went ham. He had that amazing game against FaZe in the last chance qualifier, where on Cash he did that Deagle ace. Then they managed to finish top 4 at this tournament, a massive Tier 1 tournament, by beating Astralis in the round of 8. Now, again, that's a very good finish there. Much better, actually, when you look at the period when they had God B before NiKo joined and God B with NiKo. That's a better result than they ever had beforehand, in the context of the size of the tournament, who they have to beat to get there, and what it took to get there. And it was largely due to NiKo. So people will say, right, well, that brings up my point then. NiKo warped the game to himself. NiKo made mousesports much better than they had any right being with that lineup of players and that level of talent and firepower. They were not a top 4 team in E-League Season 1. They were basically all the best teams in the world were there. They had no business getting out of that group at DreamHack Malmo. And Nex playing well alone wouldn't have done it. Then you've got to consider, part of the reason why this NiKosports era was able to get any of the good results and the good upsets and the close losses was because they actually had a factor that gave them an edge in a certain sense over a lot of teams they played, which is that unless they played teams like, in theory, SK Gaming, They actually had the best player in the server each and every time. And a guy who not only was the best player, but would have monster fragging games pretty much every single map. That gave Mouse a chance to win these games. Remember, they had no traditional or experienced in-game leader and only one truly world-class star-level talent. And yet they were able to get top 4 at a massive tier 1 tournament. This is comparable to when Shox was the in-game leader of G2 in 2016, the one where it was RPK and Scream and Body and Smiths. Okay, yeah, it wasn't perfect that Shox was the in-game leader. He wasn't an ideal in-game leader. But he made the best of a bad situation, took his own star play, realised I can be the best player in the server a lot of the time, played the game around himself and gave them some very good results, which were better than they had the rights to be. Making second place at EPL Season 3, winning ECS Season 1. These were fantastic results. So yes, NiKo called around himself and his strengths, and he did it well. He actually got a lot out of the team as a result. But remember, the logic goes, yeah, but in doing so, he made Nex worse, didn't he? Nex had already done very well at Tier 2 lands and some Tier 1 lands before NiKo joined. But you know what else he'd also done before NiKo joined? Bombed out of ESL 1 clone, never particularly performed at majors, always had issues ultimately at Tier 1 tournaments, and only had a couple with GodB that he actually had the big performances for. The reason why this got to seem like a storyline is because he played so few with GodB and did well, that when he did badly before and then GodB, and then did badly after GodB, people went, it's bloody NiKo's fault, isn't it? Well, here's the problem with that. We've now seen Nex after NiKo, haven't we? So when he was with NiKo, he continued to body Tier 2. Apparently didn't have an issue there with his style of play. He just did badly against Tier 1 like he did for most of his career before and has done most of his career since. Because remember, Nex is in a team that goes to Tier 1 tournaments now. He's in Big. And you know what? In Big, you see the same shit that you saw, but there's no NiKo to blame. He doesn't do that well against Tier 1. He dominates Tier 2. But where's NiKo? Oh, and you know what else? Nex now has his wonderful GodB, that guy who you thought could fix everything when he joined mousesports, if he'd stayed in mousesports rather. Well, he has GodB now. He doesn't do it. And you know what else? Isn't this rich? He now plays with one guy who carries the fuck out the team again, tabseN. And you know what? tabseN's not as good as NiKo was. tabseN's a pretty good player now, sometimes a sick player. He's not as good as NiKo was in his prime in the summer of 2016. And yet when tabseN has Nex, who underperforms, and has GodB even, but has never accomplished anything like the NiKosports team did, top 4 at E-League, beat Astralis in the best of 3. They've never accomplished anything close to that. No one blames tabseN and says he's probably toxic and forces Nex not to play very well, or says that GodB doesn't know how to use these players and can't use Nex properly. Everyone's conveniently forgotten that storyline, haven't they? It doesn't fit your personal views on who you like and don't like, bizarrely, right? Then you've got to consider the lineup. That was when Oscar came in. After E-League Season 1, they already had him signed, but he couldn't leave Hellraisers until this point in time, because that's when the contract began. So August 22nd, Oscar replaces Nex. So the star player who wasn't really a star player, Nex at Tier 1, is replaced by Oscar, a guy who's been dominating the fuck out of Tier 2 and looks for all the world that he's going to be a star player at Tier 1. They go to one LAN with him, Gfinity EGX. They come second there to Envious, and ultimately, Oscar does pretty poorly at the tournament. NiKo did really well against Godsent, and then just all right against Envious. So NiKo continues to play just as well, pretty much, and Oscar doesn't do well at this one LAN, and then they remove him from the active lineup. Now, the reason Oscar was removed was due to psychological problems of his own, and outside the game circumstances that, again, were his own. It wasn't NiKo who held him back from developing. I mean, actually, Oscar, when he first joined the lineup in all their Pro League games before EGX, had fragged pretty well. He'd looked really good online. The lineup looked like it was going to be much more dangerous, and it looked a lot better than it had done with Nex, without Nex in the lineup, suggesting Nex actually might have been a problem in the previous mousesports lineup, not primarily this guy dropping 40, NiKo. Then we have the fourth mousesports lineup. This is the one where Oscar gets benched in October. In comes Lowell 4 days later from Penta. The first big tournament they have was the group stage of the E-League Season 2. And this was where they beat out the Immortals and Cloud9 teams to be able to make it into the round of 8. Then they went to ESL Pro League Season 4, the one that was in Brazil, the one that Cloud9 won. Now, they did have an easy-ish run here. They were in the easier group, and then when they got to the round of 6, they played Optic, who at the time hadn't gone into their God mode and done very well, but they made top 4, but then they played Cloud9, got beaten fairly handedly by Cloud9, And funnily enough, that loss, that 0-2 loss, actually began what then became a 10-map losing streak offline. So top 4 EPL is a good result on paper, but you look who they beat, not very impressive. You look at how they were beaten in the semi-finals. Cloud9 weren't godlike. They were on a heat of that tournament, but they weren't an elite-level team in the world. And then you look at the fact that they then went on a 10-map losing streak, which carried through to IEM Oakland, where they finished in last place. And you see that this is pretty fucking underwhelming, right? I mean, Oscar, the player who could have come in and been very good, is gone. NiKo has given up a lot in this lineup. Nex is gone, and they're doing worse than ever. They go to the playoffs for E-League Season 2, where they're in the round of 8. They play Optic again. They lose to Optic this time. Obviously, Optic wins the tournament, but still weren't that great a team at that point in time. They went to the E-League Major in the beginning of 2017, and they finished 12th to 14th, so basically similar placings to before. Now, with Lowell in the team, yes, the team initially looked more cohesive. Now, should we just ignore that Nex left, actually? Not only that, but Lowell fragged pretty well early on. Chris J looked stronger when he was given more of a starring role, because in theory, Nex isn't being rammed into being a star. Chris J looked a lot better at E-League Season 2. They got out of E-League group and top 4 EPL, okay, decent enough results. But NiKo's impact was actually less on the team, and their team, as a result, couldn't build on any of those things they did. They couldn't go further in E-League. They couldn't get past top 4 when they faced a real team at EPL Season 4. In fact, with NiKo playing a bit more supportive, giving up some of the control, letting other people frag and go off, their team had the worst run they had ever had with NiKo in the lineup. They lost 10 straight maps offline because NiKo was less of a focal point, didn't just call around himself, and didn't play selfishly so that he could go ham and potentially carry the game. Now let's go and look at the last lineup that had NiKo in it. It was when Chris J was benched and Oscar came back in the lineup on January 29th, a couple of days after the major, where they were going to take this lineup to DreamHack Vegas. At DreamHack Vegas, they managed to finish top 8. Why did they finish top 8? Because NiKo went ham in the few maps they played. Because Oscar went ham in a couple of maps. The two of them were working together, as the signs had hinted to when he first joined the lineup. NiKo wasn't holding Oscar back in any sense. The firepower was better than ever. In fact, what's funny is Oscar could totally coexist with NiKo. They could totally get it done online when he first joined, and then in this lineup on LAN and against some good teams. Then if NiKo could coexist with Oscar, and Oscar could play well and get lots of frags and wasn't somehow being stubbornly held back, how come Nex couldn't coexist? Because Nex is a much worse player than Oscar. It's actually a fairly simple puzzle to solve, really. It's nothing to do with the NiKo being a great player but somehow holding his teammates back. So now let's look at the mousesports teams after NiKo's left, shall we? So on April 12th, NiKo left after DreamHack Vegas, remember? April 12th, Rops joins. And Spiddy is benched. So Spiddy's out the lineup again, Rops is in. Now, they finished top 4 at DreamHack Tours, their first tournament. It's a tier 2 tournament, but they didn't manage to get further than that. They played G2 there, who won the tournament. Admittedly, G2 was a good team. Okay, decent enough result. They had some good upsets early on. They went to ESL Pro League Season 5. They got out of the groups again, but they had to play SK Gaming. They went out there. They went to DreamHack Summer. They only finished 5th to 6th, didn't get out of the groups, but they had to play SK Gaming, admittedly, in a best of 3 to get out of the group because of an upset that I think, let me think, who had an upset? Was it CLG? I can't remember. Someone had an upset against SK Gaming. They went to ESL 1 Cologne, which wasn't a major, and they finished 9th to 11th in the Swiss system, but played pretty decently and had a hard run of opponents. They went to PGL Krakow, which they'd qualified for. They finished 12th to 14th. Similar major performance, by the way, in terms of placing that any of the NiKo teams had. And obviously it was a tough run for them. So during this lineup's history, they only had one best of 3 win offline. And that was against Singularity, that Danish team of players most of you couldn't name. And that was it. They had some good upsets in best of 1s, and they played well against some of the top teams. And they had some tough draws against SK twice in big tournaments. But they didn't have any results that were better than NiKo's mousesports lineups. Then we have the other lineup change. Lowell is released in August. They signed Sonny from Penta in August. They signed Stiko from Hellraisers in August. Dennis is released. So Lowell and Dennis out, Sonny and Stiko in. They go to DreamHack Malmo. They finish last place, 13th to 16th. Yes, they had a tough group, but they didn't make any impact on it. And some of those teams had brand new lineups. They weren't able to make any impact. They go to ESG Tour Mykonos. They win this event in surprising fashion. Not really a tier 1 event, like it had some good teams. It had SK Gaming there, but beyond SK, you're looking at Gambit, but with a new player. VP's okay. Team Liquid's pretty decent, but hasn't yet shown much. So first place was good here. You could argue that's as good as like top 4 at E-League and some of the placings that they had before in the mousesports lineup. It's certainly debatable, though, when you consider that actually Mouse didn't have to play most of the top teams. They played Heroic, who they beat, who were in really bad form. They beat Gambit with Fitch, who, yes, had done well to come top 4 at Malmo, but actually was a brand new lineup with a brand new in-game leader in Adren. They 2-0'd them. They played Virtus Pro, who was in very bad form at the moment, and they only narrowly beat them 2-1 and 16-14 on the last map. And then they beat Team Liquid in the final 3-2, and that's with Team Liquid's coach leaving, I think, on the second to last map, literally because he couldn't breathe, so they had no coach at that point in time. And then, even so, close series overall. So, mousesports with NiKo and with God B. Second place, CVOP, Season 8. Not bad, right? Highest placing in a major. After God B, NiKo carries the fuck out of them. Best player they've ever had. They finished top 4 E-League. Arguably the best performance in their history as a team. Beat Astralis in a best of 3. Again, very impressive stuff. Next gets kicked. Top 4 at EPL. Beat Optic. Yeah, but then it all goes to shit as NiKo gives up some of his role, becomes more supportive. After NiKo, 0 best of 3s won against good teams until they get the Sonny and Stiko lineup. They win Mykonos, but as I said, beat New Gambit, beat Aging VP, beat Team Liquid with the Zeus issue. So the idea that he held others back by him being too rigid or too stubborn with either how he called or how he played. Just look at how mousesports actually improved after he left. They didn't improve by him just leaving and a player coming in. What happened was mousesports made 3 different roster moves. So literally only 40% of the team of mousesports at this current point in time is the same as the last lineup that NiKo played with. And he only played with that lineup 1 tournament, which was the one where he had Oscar and it was at the DreamHack Vegas one. Now, if you count the classic NiKo era, the one that you really think of when you think of NiKo and mousesports, you're thinking of the one that had Nex and Spiddy and Dennis. There is only 20%. There's only 1 player, Chris J, remains in mousesports to this day. So is it really reasonable to suggest that this mousesports is in any sense the same as the mousesports that just happened to also have Chris J and another totally 4 different other players? Let's look at what the problems were in the classic mousesports, right? In order of problem, Nex couldn't be a big enough star at tier 1 to support NiKo. Spiddy was absolutely terrible at fragging and looked like he had issues in big tournaments. And Dennis completely had lost his ability to play any sort of role like he had for the God B team and was fragging terribly. Now, how did Mouse improve again? Oh, that's right. They cut Nex and they briefly improved. Then they looked promising after they cut Spiddy when they had Oscar. And then they won Mykonos after they cut Dennis. It's almost like cutting all those 3 players was a good idea, which is basically what people who thought NiKo was an incredible player during the summer of 2016 thought was the real problem in mousesports anyway. The bad players in it that can't play their roles and aren't good enough and have proven before and after not to be good enough players overall. They didn't, in mousesports, succeed or outdo his mousesports when he had Spiddy and Dennis in his teams. So this performance they had at Mykonos is when they don't have Spiddy and Dennis. And arguably, NiKo's performances in terms of overall results and placings were as good or better in a team with Spiddy and Dennis. That's how insane his fragging potential was. NiKo's, that is. NiKo is still the best player mousesports have ever had, is probably the best player they will ever have. He even fit the best of any star they've ever had. He carried them further than the next era, further than the post-NiKo era. He was a better carry than Oscar overall, and he consistently took them close versus the world's best teams. Mousesports didn't improve due to NiKo leaving the team.
What in God's name is that from Thorin?